Welcome to the weekend edition of Front Office Sports Today, brought to you by Invesco QQQ. In this episode, our writer David Rumsey discusses two schools, Oregon and Colorado, that left the Pac-12 and are now favored to win their power conferences that they moved to. Our reporter Amanda Christovich explains how the incoming Trump administration could reshape college sports with a particular focus on Title IX. Before all that, let's look at this weekend's most expensive college football games according to TickPick, which show that whatever the rankings say, nothing brings fans like a good rivalry. The fifth priciest game by average ticket price has Army looking to fight their way into the college football playoff at Notre Dame. Getting in will cost you an average of $212. There is similar demand for the Texas Longhorns, who have a pretty manageable matchup at home against Kentucky. Average price there is $221. The third most expensive average ticket at $243 is in Oklahoma, where the Sooners will welcome Alabama in a crucial game for the Crimson Tide. And the last two are outside the Power Four, but the rivalries are fierce. Harvard is headed to Yale in a clash of the Ivy League. Getting in there costs an average of $254. But that's nice and cheap compared to the Battle of Montana, with Montana headed to Montana State. If you want to get in, the average cost is $348. Up next, my colleague David Rumsey takes a look at Oregon and Colorado. The Ducks have been the class of the Big Ten and are favored by some to win the championship. The Buffaloes still need to play their way into the playoff, but doing so would show an incredible ascent for the Deion Sanders-led team. We discussed all that and plenty more, and that's coming up next. Joined now by Front Office Sports newsletter writer David Rumsey. Welcome, David.
Hey, Owen. Thanks for having me.
Yep, great to have you on as always. So at the time of recording, we have two former Pac-12 teams, one at the top of their conference in Oregon, one Colorado that is now favored to win their conference. A lot of threads to tug on here. Let's start with Oregon. So after a whole lot of number crunching, they have now clinched a spot in the Big Ten championship. What do you make of that team and their season?
Yeah, it was kind of funny. They beat Wisconsin on Saturday, and then it doesn't come out until Tuesday that the Big Ten says, hey, Oregon has actually clinched a spot in the Big Ten championship game. This whole long statement, not anything controversial. I mean, I think everybody expected Oregon to be in that title game anyways, but they list off 10 different scenarios in which Oregon and Ohio State and Indiana, who those two are playing on Saturday, all these finishes. Well, there's no way that Oregon can't make the Big Ten championship game. So here we go. And it's just kind of the new age that we're in with these mega conferences. The Big Ten is at 18 teams. It's just so complicated that, typically you're like, after a game is over, it's like, and with that, so-and-so clinches this playoff berth or whatever, but not the case. And maybe it was just a, specific instance, but yeah, really, really kind of showcases the day and age that we're in now with these big new conferences.
Yeah, it's a good point where, some of these like intra-conference calculations are just that much more complicated with so many teams. And yeah, it used to be like, you're undefeated, like you're good, you're win. You almost certainly won your conference, and yeah, you can go from there. And yeah, just now the permutations, I guess, are a little bit too numerous so that it takes 3 days to figure something that like everyone assumes to be true. It was true.
Right. And you make an interesting point that, usually if you're undefeated, you might get in, or, that didn't happen with Florida State last year. But right now we have Indiana, who is undefeated, and they're traveling to Ohio State on Saturday for their biggest game of the season. And because the Big Ten is so big now, 18 teams, like we said, in this new conference realignment, conference expansion, et cetera. If you look at the numbers, Indiana hasn't really played that many good teams within the Big Ten. So that undefeated ranking is really going to be put to the test against Ohio State, who does have a loss, but it's against the number one team in the country, which is Oregon, also in the Big Ten. So it's just kind of interesting now that these conferences are so big. You could have a really hard schedule within your conference or a really easy schedule within your conference, and it certainly makes it, difficult on the college football playoff committee. Many people might not think that Indiana should be the number 5 ranked team in the country. Maybe Indiana fans think they should be higher. But I guess that's why we'll settle it on the field.
Yeah, but it is an interesting point about how, just like the scheduling game is going to be, that's always part of this, obviously. But I wonders how programs are going to be looking at this year. And, if you're a 2-loss team, but you had a really tough schedule, is that better than being undefeated with a, more of a cakewalk schedule? So yeah, I just wonder how the 12-team playoff will affect, programs' desires to maybe have tougher schedules.
Yeah, and you can certainly schedule tougher non-conference games on the road, neutral sites, at home, whatever. But, your conference schedule isn't really up to you. There's all kinds of formulas that gets determined, and if you have a rivalry game, etc. But yeah, and so I don't know how long ago Indiana's schedule, their conference schedule in the Big Ten, was made or solidified, but it wasn't really up to them. But it just turns out that the teams that they're playing this year aren't really the cream of the crop, and so you almost can never avoid just the criticism of who do you schedule, who do you play? You haven't played enough teams. But I guess at the end of the day, there is a chance to come in and prove it on the field, like I said. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting point you make.
Yeah. Let's hop over to Colorado. I remember interviewing you on the shows either right before their first game or like maybe after they had the shocking first win under Sanders last year. And that kind of like was their big, like, coming out. It was somewhere around there. And I remember asking you, like, when are we going to know, like, what Deion and what this program is really bringing? And I think you said it's going to take like 2 or 3 years,
yeah,
which I think was prescient. But, we're coming to the end of year 2 here. And, they're currently in second place in the Big 12 and have a very good shot to win to win the conference. So yeah, just give us your thoughts on like the Deion era at this moment.
Yeah. I mean, after BYU lost last week, Colorado actually became the betting favorite at most sports books to win the Big 12 championship. So this is not a sports betting show. I'm not going to tell anybody to go put all your money on Coach Prime and Shedeur Sanders. But, I don't think a lot of people saw this coming heading into year 2. There's so much hoopla last year, and we all remember the huge attendance numbers and the celebrities at the games in Boulder and the big TV ratings and all that stuff. And at the end of the day, Colorado didn't do much on the field. Well, this year they've really improved. They became bowl eligible, midway through the season, and now they're potentially in line to earn a CFP berth. If they win out, they would win the Big 12. They would have to probably beat BYU in that Big 12 championship game in December, which is no easy task. They could stumble against Kansas on Saturday, but the point is they're in a spot now that not a lot of experts saw them being in. And I think it's, clear if we look back to all the hoopla that we saw last year. Imagine that now on steroids around a Big 12 title game that is a de facto play-in game for a berth into the CFP. Or imagine Colorado going on the road for a playoff game, or in if they get a first round bye, perhaps, and they're in a quarterfinal game at a huge bowl game. I mean, the TV ratings, the ticket numbers, the ticket prices, just everything about Deion Sanders and Coach Prime is going to be through the roof. And whether you like it or not, you're probably going to have to pay attention to it.
Yeah, for sure. And what's that going to mean in terms of just like, the program, maybe for Sanders himself, Deion, that is, is this going to be like a big financial haul for them?
Yeah, I mean, I would think so. I mean, Deion signed like a $30 million contract or so when he started last year. So I don't know if he would be in for any kind of raise there. There's obviously been talks of, with Shedeur Sanders going into the draft, he's probably going to be a top 5 pick, and Travis Hunter is going to be leaving as well. Does Deion want to stay? He says he does, but then you have people saying, oh, he should go coach the Cowboys or, wherever, or maybe Florida State would try to get him, all kinds of rumors. And, we can't get into predicting any of that, but yeah, absolutely. There is just even more interest on Deion Sanders as he continues to prove himself on the field, and certainly could capitalize on that further.
Yeah. And, that kind of brings up that this is going to be a program in transition, after this year, one way or another. Shedeur is going to the draft. Travis Hunter's declared for the draft. We just heard that they've got a 5-star freshman recruit coming in, Julian Lewis, but he'll be a freshman. The questions about Deion are going to be there until he's on the sidelines next year, and I imagine he will be. But it's still a question until he is. Yeah, it'll just be interesting to see if they can keep this momentum going without his kid there and without Travis Hunter as it's like this pretty unique force.
Yeah, absolutely. The question will be, does he want to stay and build a legacy there, or is this just the next stop along the way? And even if he does leave, I mean, I think Colorado fans and administrators would say it was worth it, just the boost that he's given the school and the program and everything. But certainly they would like to keep him longer than just this year. But I know for right now the focus is on his focus, and that team's focus is on getting into the playoff, winning their conference, getting into the CFP, and seeing what could happen. I mean, it would still be a long road from there if they did make it into that playoff bracket. But I just imagine the craziness that would come with Coach Prime in the college football playoff. I think we would all be a fan of just seeing what would happen.
Yeah, should be fun to watch. David Rumsey, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Owen.
Up next, our reporter Amanda Christovich looks into how the new presidential administration could alter the reach and enforcement of Title IX and what that would mean for women's collegiate sports. Here's our conversation. Joining me now is front office sports reporter Amanda Christovich. Welcome, Amanda.
Hey, how's it going?
Great to have you on. So President-elect Trump has made some pretty big, bold statements on his plans for education. And of course, this could have some big effects on college sports. The biggest one is that he said he wants to eliminate the Department of Education. We'll see if that comes to pass. But what kinds of effects are you at least potentially anticipating in the world of college sports from some pretty massive changes here?
It's interesting that Trump wants to get rid of the Department of Education for many reasons, obviously. And he tried to do this in his last administration, but wasn't able to because it requires an act of Congress, and he just didn't have the support then. But let's say he has the support now. We don't know whether he does or not, but if he does, and he's able to dismantle the Department of Education, the question is, for college sports, what happens to Title IX? Title IX is the law that governs gender equity in sports. It's not specifically a sports law, but that's how it's interpreted. It prohibits sex-based discrimination in educational settings, and that has been extended to include sports. So that's why we have such robust women's sports programs all across the country in high school, college, any federally funded educational entity. But that statute is governed through the Department of Education. It is monitored, adjudicated. The only way to really have a Title IX, rule be enforced is if there is a complaint filed to the Department of Education. The Office of Civil Rights, which is in the Department of Education, will, decide whether or not to take up that case. So the question becomes, if there's no Department of Education, what happens to Title IX? Trump hasn't said. If you look at Project 2025, which Trump attempted to distance himself from, it's the conservative policy playbook that some of his former advisors have contributed to, let's just say that their idea, because they also talk about dismantling the Department of Education, they talk about putting the Title IX enforcement and Office of Civil Rights that enforces it into the Department of Justice. And so in that way, the only way to adjudicate gender equity, especially related to sports, would be through litigation. We have no idea, right? This is all hypothetical about whether or not that would make it more difficult for Title IX enforcement, which is already, difficult. But the expert, at least one of the experts that I spoke with, called it a shell game. She basically said that there was no way that putting the OCR into the Department of Justice was going to help Title IX adjudication or monitoring. If anything, it was going to strip it completely and just sort of keep it there as keep it there in name and almost, in face, but have no teeth.
So in a couple of those scenarios, Title IX would still exist as a law, but essentially be unenforceable or just very difficult to enforce.
Even more difficult to enforce than it already is. And just to give you, there was a USA Today investigation that found that 87% of the schools that, they looked at more than 100 schools, 87% of them were out of compliance with Title IX. And just to give you an example, Title IX compliance means, equitable sports participation opportunities, right? How many roster spots do you have on women's sports teams versus men's sports? It could mean resource allocation. It could mean facilities. Do the women play in, a dinky gym and the men play in the NBA arena down the street? right? All of those things relate to Title IX. So that's what, I mean, there are other issues that Title IX covers, like sexual assault and harassment, but just from a pure sort of sports on-field standpoint, it's about resources and opportunities.
And just really basic question on that. If a school, like many do, have a huge football program where there's, 20 million plus going to the roster and the coaches, and they probably have facilities that they spent 9 figures on, is there any way for them to be Title IX compliant?
I think that would be a question for a legal expert, honestly. It doesn't have to be like the same amount of money. It's about percentages, and it's about, equitable versus equal, if that makes sense. For example, obviously football rosters are huge. So there are usually more women's teams in an athletic department that has football than men's teams, because it's about the roster spots that have to be equal versus the teams, if that makes sense. So that's something that they could look at. Football is also weird because there's no like women's varsity football that the NCAA sponsors. So it's not like there's a women's team to be like, are they playing in the same stadium? It's a bit strange how it has to be, sort of put together side by side. But there are ways to, comply with Title IX with a big football program. Doesn't mean a lot of the schools are, though.
I'm skeptical that, Trump will successfully eliminate the Department of Education. I don't know if he'll be able to get it into the Department of Justice or Title IX into the Department of Justice. But assuming his nominee to run the department, Linda McMahon, becomes, the head of that department, what can she do, assuming she's got, largely the same agenda as the incoming Trump administration?
Well, what we saw in the previous Trump administration under Betsy DeVos, the Department of Education really just kind of was not enforcing Title IX in the ways that it had in some previous administrations. And that's a common theme. Republican administrations, tend to, according to experts, right, like they tend to be less interested in enforcing Title IX. Sometimes, there's this idea of government overreach there, right? So I think that will probably happen again. There will be even less enforcement of Title IX than there currently is. And then there's this question of how it's going to be interpreted. So Linda McMahon can say, in the case of college athlete revenue sharing, right? Is that subject to Title IX? She could say yes, no, maybe. Is the Biden administration had an executive order that interpreted Title IX to include all gender identities, to protect all gender identities, including transgender people. Trump has said he's going to reverse that, and I imagine Linda McMahon's DOE will do the same, and not, adjudicate cases where there's discrimination based on, a non-binary person or a transgender person. It's just going to be, male and female, or sex assigned at birth is the way they describe it. So I think those are some of the changes that we're going to have to watch for, and we're going to have to see. But, Linda McMahon is a Trump loyalist, so I think it is pretty safe to assume that her views on transgender athletes, her views on, the adjudication of Title IX are going to be pretty much in line with Trump's.
And does this apply to all the schools essentially, or is it all the public schools, or is it like all the public schools, but that's going to, have the same effective changes on the private schools? What's the jurisdiction here?
Yeah, it's every federally funded university. And so I feel like a lot of people don't realize, but private schools do receive federal funding. So, unless there's a rare case in which a university does not receive federal funding, this really impacts, I think it's safe to look at this as if it impacts every university that you know of, with the exception of a university that doesn't receive federal funding.
All right. Well, very interesting. Obviously, a lot to watch in the coming years. Amanda Christovich, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
That's it for today. Leave us a rating or review wherever you like to tune in and tell your friends about the show. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on Monday.